Good afternoon, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Kiritsis. Today I'll be giving you a little talk on the Christmas goblins in Greek tradition, which are called Kallikantzaroi. Given, of course, that it's Christmas, what a wonderful time to do it. What a suitable time. Christmas has always been a season infused with the spirit of anticipation, as well as the mutual exchange of well wishes and presents. Then there are those oppressively opulent, shall we say, Christmas lunches and dinners in which the vast majority of partakers gorge themselves as if it were their last day on earth, and spend the next 3 weeks nervously evading the bathroom scales and wondering why they did it. All too often, a lack of restraint and conditioning is reason for one to curse the very celebration he or she had embraced with fervour only days ago. It goes without saying that for our children, the experience of Christmas is vastly different. The senseless and meaningless complexities of the ego haven't quite developed yet. The burden of responsibility is altogether absent, and the essence of their being is faithfully entwined around a pole of endless feasibility. Nothing and nobody ever befuddles children in their creative moment of imagining and roleplay. Two endeavours that imbue the cosmos with meaning and purpose and is almost always jettisoned or lost when one sheds the skin of their childhood. When I was a youngster, I remember waking up to the pungent smell of sliced bread being roasted in the toaster and the sight of numerous Christmas presents underlying the tinsel ladder and star-crowned Christmas tree in the lounge room. Those were the days when I was mortified by gruesome, malevolent creatures that went bump in the night, and slipped through dimensional portals to escape into fantastical realms when reality seemed bland and lackluster. Those were the days when I searched frantically for the tooth fairy that left me money in a drinking glass, as a reward for having shed my first teeth, of course, when I tiptoed into the lounge room near the Christmas tree, expecting to catch Father Christmas in his philanthropic act of scattering presents beneath our tree, and when assuming the role of evil characters from fairy tales and stories was an avenue that led to the enchantment of Mother Nature herself. Everything was novel then. Everything was sacred, holy, magical, enchanting, and mystifying even. Sometimes I'd like to think that I haven't quite lost that spring morning magic. My childhood wand is still about, perhaps in a green leather chest somewhere in the old basement. All I really need to do is find it. I remember, quite vividly, the spirit in which we celebrated Christmas in my early years. What made the season soulful and endearing wasn't the idea of scrumptious and lavish banquets or presents, or even the notion of Father Christmas descending into our residence from that charred conduit above the fireplace. It was the many stories, in fact, that were told by my charismatic grandmother about a species of menacing goblins called, or what she called, the Kallikantzaroi, who emerged from their subterranean lairs during the 12 days of Christmas in order to wreak havoc and lead the unassuming among us astray. For me, the foreboding presence of demonic minions and their subsequent running amok during the same period in which the anniversary of the birth of the Son of Christ, of God, was celebrated seemed contradictory to a degree. And on the other hand, well, enthralling. As far as mythographers, folklorists, and historians are able to discern, the folkloristic tradition relating to the Kallikantzaroi are an entirely Greek and Turkish affair. Belief in them was rife in the Hellenistic lands during the Ottoman occupation, and it appears likely that the tradition subsisted amidst rustic consciousness well into the 20th century. The Kallikantzaroi were held by most Greeks to be the spawn of evil. They thrive deep inside the dark, moist womb of the earth, and when not in a state of slumber, busied themselves by gnawing at the trunk of the great world tree. their collective ambition was to annihilate the human race by undercutting enough bark from the axial giant as to topple the cosmos. Legend has it that their task neared completion in late December, a time at which the ethereal gates bridging different dimensions would be flung open and allow intermingling between different order of beings. The gates would remain open between Christmas Day and the festival of the Epiphany of the 5th of the new year, allowing the Kallikantzaroi to bring their duplicitous, mischievous and homicidal reign of terror to the earth. On closer inspection, their mingling with human beings wasn't an altogether lamentable affair. Their temporary absence from the subterranean was humanity's saving grace, for it allowed the bark around the trunk of the world tree to regenerate and thus continue nourishing the three tributaries of the cosmos, which of course are heaven, earth and underworld. Just as we have UFO enthusiasts nowadays reporting various species of extraterrestrial visitors, so too were the rustics of Greek proper, convinced that there were two distinct classes of Kallikantzaroi, each with their unique physical characteristics and temperaments. The first were about 2 meters in height, lean and powerfully built, resembling the ape-like American cryptid Bigfoot. The list of physical characteristics appear to vary from place to place, though most are in unanimous agreement that these types possessed horribly deformed faces, translucent red eyes and tongues, black skin and shaggy hair, the ears of goats or asses, the arms of monkeys, razor-sharp talons, and protruding horns. They were also equipped with oversized heads and penises. A great many were lame. They were also vile in terms of their physiognomy, and that was matched only by their tasteless pranks, as well as their heinous and murderous intent. These types prided themselves in their ability to suffocate their human victims by sitting on their chests while they slept complacent in their beds, or alternatively strangling them outright, slashing their throats open and then gulping down their oxygen-rich blood. The second variety was scanter in number, shorter in stature and stayed faithful to anthropomorphic forms. Most tried to imitate healthy 6 or 7-year-old children, but differed from the former in that they exhibited smooth, blackened and sometimes putrefying skin, in addition to a horde of other physical characteristics. It appears that these smaller types were kind of frivolous, boisterous and somewhat innocuous when juxtaposed with their much larger cousins. Chief amongst their concerns was the incitement of pandemonium and the widespread promotion of social disintegration. Like a great many other mythological creatures, or what the Greeks term exotica, of Hellenistic folklore, the Kallikantzaroi were confined to an eternal sphere of influence and commenced at dusk and ceased at daybreak. Because direct sunlight would blind them and subsequently render them dust, the daytime hours were spent reposed in the dark recesses of caves or windmills. A Kallikantzaros might bide his time ruminating about how many households he can bring to ruin in one night, swimming in subterranean rivers or feasting upon snakes, salamanders, lizards and other reptiles to rejuvenate his energies. During this time, the rustic population were raising what they believed to be incumbent prophylactics to ward off these nocturnal attacks. Many people would resort to nailing large crosses or the lower jaws of a pig to their front doors, drawing figures of black crosses on the main archway over their door, or burning frankincense and myrrh in an attempt to keep their demonic intruders out. Others used methods quintessentially more pagan in character, like hanging bits of thistle, asparagus or hyssop on the chimney or outside the door. And it is alleged that the Kallikantzaroi were cantankerous, stupid and largely void of any common sense. So to dupe them, all one had to do was to leave a sieve or a bundle of flax on the front porch. Given their ephemeral nature of their concentration, the implements would serve as enumerative distractions, so to speak, keeping them busy until the crack of dawn, whence they would be forced to drop everything and flee. It was believed that Kallikantzaroi feared fire and encompassed an inherent aversion towards black roosters. Hence, townfolk would probably make every attempt to have one of those or both around. Fire proved to be quite a formidable ally, for it fortified a part of the house that would have otherwise remained easy access to the would-be intruders. During the 12 days of Christmas, householders would keep the fireplace going unremittently and leave the ashes of the hearth untouched. Following the purification of waters that typified the ritual of the Epiphany, a time also believed to signal the return of the Kallikantzaroi to the underworld, the head of the house would round up the ashes, now endued with magical properties owing to a presumed interaction with the supernatural beings, and disperse them over his crops to facilitate good produce. In the case that one or all of these prophylactics failed and one came face to face with the Kallikantzaroi during the 12 days, he or she was advised to disregard their senseless banter and only open one's mouth as to recite prayers and incantations. Kallikantzaroi were like the water nymphs, so to speak. Once their presence was acknowledged, their powers multiplied and they were able to exercise a definitive influence over the individual. Another didactic piece of traditional anecdotal literature advises that the first question a Kallikantzaroi is bound to ask any innocent bystander is, "Will you have tau of me or lead?" To which the one-word response, "Tau," should be given. The latter renders the malevolent forces impotent. Some of the anecdotal stories told about their level of foolhardiness make for a lively home entertainment, especially during the festive year-end season. One which has remained with me through the years is the story of how a beautiful young woman was able to evade the Machiavellian intent of a little Kallikantzaroi. On Christmas Eve, or so the folktale says, the woman stayed at home for the sole purpose of preparing a late-night dinner, whilst her husband and children attended Mass. After a short while, she became acutely aware of something flitting about behind her. Pivoting on her heels, she came face to face with a blackened, misshapen child that seemed to mutate before her very eyes. The woman intuitively knew that she was in the presence of a Kallikantzaroi. It proceeded to scurry about on all fours like an arachnid, laughing hysterically and defecating everywhere before granting her his undivided attention. "What is your name?" the creature asked. Mindful of all that had been imparted about these flippant but dangerous goblins, she replied, "I, myself." The Kallikantzaroi went on scampering about and upsetting furniture, intensely fascinated and absorbed by its own ability to break and tear things, until the woman finally mustered enough courage to launch a counter-attack. Angered beyond reckoning, the woman took a sweltering saucepan off the stove and hurled it at the Kallikantzaroi, striking him just below the jaw. The creature yelped out in pain and rushed outside into the somnolent darkness, eager to show the burn to his fellow peers and gain their widespread support. When the small Kallikantzaroi was prompted to disclose the identity of the individual who had committed this atrocity against him, he blurted out, "I, myself." The group broke out in a cacophony of laughter. Some mocked him, others poked and prodded him. In the end, the consensus was that he had behaved like an imbecile and was hence undeserving of any pity. In this way, the young woman evaded any wrathful retaliation on their part and lived to tell the tale. Another tale, this one indigenous to the island of Skiros in the Sporades, speaks of a young man who ran into some wandering Kallikantzaroi whilst returning home from the mill one night. His gut instinct was to stretch himself out between two sacks of wheat on his mule's back, in the manner that planking enthusiasts nowadays prostrate themselves almost everywhere. To complete the facade, he blanketed himself with a pleated rug, as to fuel the illusion that he was just another sack of wheat. By their very exposure to this rustic lifestyle, the illusion, the Kallikantzaroi had learned that wandering donkeys and mules were usually accompanied by human masters. Soon they had congregated around the mule, examining the load on its saddle and pulling the reins some. One of them muttered. So, there's a sack of wheat on either side of this mule, and an even bigger one in the middle. So, where's the man gone? The Kallikantzaroi attempted to solve the mystery by either backtracking to the mule's place of origin, which was the mill, or venturing on ahead, frequently returning to the animal to vocalize the same concern, but all to no avail. There's a sack of wheat on either side of the mule, and an even bigger one in the middle. So, where's the man gone? Riddled by this question of how the mule's master had dematerialized into thin air, took up just enough time for the man to arrive home unassailed. Before the heinous goblins could recover their wits about them, the man cried out to his wife for assistance. His wife hurled open the door, and within seconds he and his bags of wheat were reposed inside the haven of his own home. Realizing at once that they'd been duped, the Kallikantzaroi marched up to the front porch and thumped furiously on the door. His wife, the shrewder of the two partners, was quick to act. She appeared at the window near the door and told him that if they could correctly enumerate the holes in her sieve, she would grant them entrance without any objection. Oblivious of their intellectual incompetency in arithmetic, the Kallikantzaros hastily accepted her challenge. Elated at this, the woman suspended the sieve from a cord and lowered it to them from a high window. They snatched it up and proceeded to count, but before reaching double figures, they became puzzled and had to start over again. Their tribulations went on and on and on, until the first light appeared and they had to flee. Remarkably, the origin of this folkloristic belief remains pretty much shrouded in obscurity. In examining the physical and temperamental characteristics of the Kallikantzaroi, along with the prophylactics aimed against them, one is bound to find parallels with the traditional lore surrounding the Greek vampire and the Greek nymph. Crosses, pigs' heads and herbs, for instance, were also used to ward off beings of many different natures in ages bygone, and the notion of denying a supernatural entity power through the purposeful observance of silence extends to nearly all cases of the exotica. Variant hypotheses have run the gauntlet of the purpose of gaining conventional acceptance, yet none have fully succeeded. The view, for example, that Kallikantzaroi are an archetypal projection and personification of night terrors has been criticised as being a simple and one-dimensional view, dismissive of the fears they were able to strike in the collective psyche. A much more viable perspective has been offered by folklorist George Megas, whose academic opinion gravitates around around the idea that the goblins are a memotype of which relay the ancient eschatological belief that Pluton would fling open the gates to the underworld for the temporary liberation of deceased souls on the day of the year celebrated as the Athenian festival of the Anthesteria. His impression would have been more than satisfying had it not been for the calendrical incongruities between these two events. Perhaps the most curious approach is that of Bernard Smith, who chooses to describe an origin for the Kallikantzaroi based on the etymological root of the name itself. He argues that the word for the goblins is comprised of two Turkish root words which mean black and werewolf, inexplicably linking the tradition to the shape-shifting transformation of man into a wolf known in Greek as a lycanthropos. This notion acquires an even greater viability when one takes into account the shared traits between the two supernatural entities and the propensity of the Peloponnese rustics to use the two terms interchangeably in describing the Christian goblins. Despite its feasibility, there's one other theory which issues a much sounder note on the historiographical scale and overshadows the above mentioned completely. Put forth by Nicholas Politis, the model identifies the Kallikantzaroi as the collective memories of a pagan festival of the winter solstice that was celebrated in antiquity under the aegis of the Chronia or the Dionysia, and involved dressing up in costume, drinking oneself into a stupor, and behaving in frivolous and counterfeit ways. For Politis, the Kallikantzaroi are nothing more than the psychic interpolations ensouled by themes and images belonging to a primordial pagan masquerade. And on that note, that concludes my little episode on the Kallikantzaroi, on the little goblins. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you next time for more. Take care.